Thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this very important discussions on the role of private sector in the implementation of Ghana's climate action, or what we call the nationally determined contributions, as part of government's commitment to the Paris Agreement. I mean, it's quite clear that we have quite a very well panel with great lot of experience in the subject matter of climate finance, climate action, and the role of private sector in the country. And with me today is one Mr. Richard Aku, who has worked over several years with the International Finance Corporation, ICF, IFC, sorry, and also worked with some private banks in the country, and even a co-manager as one of the leading companies in Africa in the area of health infrastructure, if I can say. So he has quite a lot of experience on the role of private sector in implementing most development projects in Africa in general, in Ghana in particular. With me also is Mr. Peter Derry, who is a lawyer over several years experience in the legal practice, and also the Director of Environment with the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology, and Innovation. He has over 22 decades of experience in implementing policies around climate, biodiversity, and entire environments in the country, and is quite very much experienced in the area of Ghana's commitment to the Paris Agreement. With us here is also Dr. Daniel Binifu, who is the UNFCCC focal point for Ghana and also Deputy Director at Ghana's Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, the distinguished panelists, for this very important session of investment opportunity for private sector in Ghana's in the implementation of Ghana's NDCs. So I would proceed by having, first of all, to hear from Peter Derry on what is it what is the NDCs? What are the climate actions? What is it about for private sector to even, for distinguished participants to be able to understand it much better? I know there are three broad areas that is required in order for government to be able to implement their climate action. One basically had to do with financing, and one also had to do with technology, and another had to do with capacity building. So, and without the role of the private sector, it may be impossible for the government of Ghana to be able to implement their climate action. So I would like you to give us some highlights of what the NDCs are and the kind of enabling environment that the government has created in order to ensure the full participation of the private sector in the implementation of climate action. So Mr. Peter Derry, over to you. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Kansuk, for the introduction and for the question. Yes, so the nationally determined contributions emanates from the Paris Agreement and the Conference of Parties decisions that every country submits a number of actions or programs that the country itself commits to undertake in order to contribute towards ensuring that we achieve the global target of 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 if we all become ambitious. So basically, the NDCs are our country's program for contributing towards the attainment of the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And basically, the main objective of the agreement is to ensure that we obtain the 2 degrees target that has been set globally in terms of temperature. So that is basically what it is. It also means that the NDCs are a vehicle through which Ghana will be able to contribute towards sustainable development and also raking in green investments. It further also shows that the NDCs are the blueprints of government in terms of when it comes to climate action over the next 10 years, that is from now till the year 2030. Now, Ghana submitted its initial national determined contributions in 2015 and subsequently ratified same in 2016. Under Article 4.2 and 4.11 of the Paris Agreement and Decision 1/CP21, paragraph 23 and 24, countries are mandated to revise their national determined contributions every 5 years. Remember, I said we submitted our initial national determined contributions in 2015 and 2016, subsequently when we ratified it. So 5 years down the line, we are mandated by the Paris Agreement to revise same, ensure that we include actions that we find emerging since 2016, new policies that have come up, so that we are also able to take out what is it that has been done and to include what we would want to do in the next 10 years. So Ghana has, through a very extensive consultative process and through series of meetings, come up now with a new national determined contribution document that will be submitted to the UNFCCC come by December or November this year. So I would want at this point to focus my discussions around the revised NDCs, since this is now going to be the blueprint for the next 9 or 10 years. So with that understanding, the NDCs as revised are supposed to respond to new policy directions. They're supposed to ensure we improve upon implementation. They're supposed to ensure that we bring about synergies with SDGs. They're supposed to ensure that we obtain full buy-in from both state and non-state actors. They're supposed to ensure that we bring on board subnational level actors, non-state actors, private sector, civil society, and also to ensure that we bring on board any missing technologies that were probably not captured previously. Therefore, the reason for the revision is to increase the commercial and investment attractiveness to the NDCs. So this must be clearly established. And that's how come the private sector is very critical in the discussions that we are having today. Now, if you look at the NDCs cover some thematic areas. The first area has to do with deforestation and landscape restoration. Then we have electric mobility and mass transportation. Then we have integrated water resource management, alternative waste management, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture and food production systems, low carbon electricity generation, and then the decarbonization of our oil and gas industry. Now, an understanding of these thematic areas gives a clear indication that the private sector would definitely be needed. So in total, we have 47 programs now, programs of actions for the NDCs. And we are covering 11 sectors, and we are expected to mobilize at least 9.3 billion in the next 10 years. At least. It means that it could be more. But per the estimates and per the projections that we have now, at least the minimum amount of investments that we need should not be below a $9.3 billion for the next 10 years. Now, if you look at this $9.3 billion for the next 10 years, it is obvious that the government alone will not be able to provide this amount of resources. And so we are looking at a mixed bag of resources. We're looking at resources both from the domestic and also international, and therefore also looking at public and private resources. So the private resources definitely will come from the private sector. And if you further look at the breakdown of the NDCs that we have, a chunk of them have been classified as unconditional, as conditional. Conditional means that these are resources that will come outside the basket of the country or government. So that also clearly indicates that we definitely will need the private sector to come on board because of the conditional program of actions that have been identified. So what is it that government is doing to ensure that we are able to rake in these green investments and also bring in the private sector? At the policy level and coming from the NDC document, this time the NDC document has clearly defined how much or which program of actions should come from where. And so we have categorized our sources of funding based on what will come from government, what is expected to come from multilaterals, bilateral sources, private sector, and innovative financing. And so we have a number of program actions that are targeted at the private sector. One good example here is when it comes to alternative waste management. Government already is into some PPPs with the private sector to ensure that the private sector establish a number of recycling plants and compost plants across this country. And so without the private sector, the component of alternative waste management in the NDCs will not be achieved. And there are clear targets as to how much emissions will be reduced as a result of the contribution of the private sector in the establishment of these compost plants. Another very good example is the fact that government has created an opportunity by entering into bilateral cooperative agreements with some countries like Switzerland, where government has initiated the process of establishing this kind of bilateral relationship to create opportunity for the private sector to mobilize green investments in the area of renewable energy, cook stoves, and also alternative waste management. These are clear opportunities that also exist for the private sector. So there are a number of activities that one can definitely clearly see that these activities are geared towards bringing in the private sector. But even before I conclude this first question, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is an article that encourages emission trading. It brings on board the private sector to be able to invest in emission reductions and be able to sell same for money in exchange of the emissions that they would have saved or reduced as a result of certain interventions. To be able to implement Article 6, the government of Ghana has put together certain mechanisms to make this work. We are currently establishing a national registry. We are developing an Article 6 strategy document. We are developing manuals that will guide how the implementation of Article 6 will be done. And we are sooner than later going to embark on building capacity of the private sector. And already we are even doing that with the Private Enterprise Federation, where we have been able to establish 2 climate platforms, one for adaptation and one for mitigation. And we're working with them. We are now going to focus the work that we are doing with them on Article 6, how they can participate in the carbon markets. And so these are some of the clear opportunities that government is trying to create to be able to rake in green investments from the private sector. So there are many opportunities in there.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive overview of what the NDCs are and the role that the private sector can play and the kind of enabling environments that government has created in order to ensure that we get the full participation of the private sector in implementing Ghana climate action. I mean, you mentioned the area of waste. I know there's quite a lot of studies that the government itself, led by the Ministry of Environment, that has undertaken some studies with the Ministry of Finance on private sector investment potentials in the energy sector, in the waste management sector, and the kind of collaborations that you have with the Swiss government, as you have mentioned, in terms of getting the private sector to be involved in the implementation of Ghana climate action. That's quite clear. But even before we proceed to Richard, who has quite a lot of extensive experience working with the private sector and mobilizing financing, structuring financing to implement most development projects, especially infrastructure-related climate actions in Africa and in Ghana. But with Daniel Benifu, maybe you probably, I'll get back to you, but we would like you to give us more in-depth into the practical, how would the private sector itself be involved in that very good idea that is mentioned by Peter about the collaboration or the cooperation that you have with the Swiss government, the exact role that you expect that the private sector will play in that. But I would move on to Mr. Richard Aku. We know that most of the time, I mean, most private sector think that they don't have any major role to play in terms of climate action. Also because of the fact that they think that it's the role of governments that would have to lead in the implementation of climate action, and quite limited role that the private sector is expected to play because of some kind of challenges that they usually face. Will you be able to tell us the practical challenges that private sector face in terms of involvement in the implementation of climate agenda in Ghana or in Africa that you know of? What are the practical challenges that you would want to give us? And in doing so, you may also want to proceed to give us how can we be able to address those challenges to ensure the full participation of the private sector in the implementation of Ghana's climate action. Over to you, Mr. Agbo.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think from my perspective, a good start is that when you have a look at the 47 programs that have been identified, you can see that intuitively, a good majority of these programs could have the potential for significant private sector investment and involvement, both in terms of managing and operating these projects and financing these projects and ensuring the technology transfer to these projects. So I think the set of projects and programs that the government has outlined should be attractive to the private sector. And now the focus is how do we now get the private sector fully involved to implement these programs. One of the key points is the issue of policy direction from the government. For a lot of these programs, the government has indeed outlined policy statements and programs to support these sectors. However, I think what is needed is very clear examples of the government's commitment to implementing these policies. Examples including specific areas of where the private sector has already been brought in to participate in a sector under the current policies that the government has rolled out. I think this is important evidence to the private sector that the government, beyond the issuance of the policy, is fully committed to ensuring that the private sector is involved. So I think for each of these areas of policy, the government should go the extra step of identifying where the private sector has already been involved and showcase that as an example to others that they are fully committed to bringing the private sector on board into these areas. The second part is that it is always important to have a clear identification of projects under each of the programs. When you look at the renewable energy, for example, there are discussions in the programs outlined for mini grids, for solar, and for wind power. Again, in all these areas, I'm sure the government has received several offers to undertake projects in this space. And it is important that the government is able to outline exactly what it wants to achieve in this space and outline these projects very clearly to the private sector, and then go through a transparent process for selecting the projects that they want to support and push these projects to the finish line. So if, for example, the government has outlined that they want to undertake 150 to 250 megawatts of scale of solar in the country within a period of time, the government should work with the private sector to clearly select the projects that they believe fit into this 150 to 250 megawatts, and then go the next step of then supporting the identified private sector behind these projects to push those projects forward. So some transparent process for selecting the projects and selecting the private sector to push the projects forward under the various programs, I think would be very helpful to the private sector and help to ensure that many of these projects do get to the finish line. The part of financing of these projects is very important. The financing, I think the policies outline a clear host of potential financiers, including local banks, including international banks, including the multilaterals, and the various climate funds. Again, for example, in the Ghanaian environment, there is the possibility for the government to work with the local banks to identify their interest in supporting some of the programs under the NDCs and identify how the government is going to support these banks in understanding these projects and in structuring the financing for these projects. Okay, so I think where the government proactively engages with the local banks to seek their support for these projects and to support them in implementing them, I think will go a very long way in bringing the finances together. In addition, even for the multilaterals, the government, especially through the Ministry of Finance, can play a very proactive role in shopping some of these important projects and programs to the multilaterals and seeking their support to bring these projects on board and get to the finish line. And then lastly, I think what is always important is that when the private sector indicates interest in a project and indicates their willingness to support the project, invariably, the private sector will always encounter some hurdles or some challenges in executing the project. The government has a very clear role to work with the private sector to address any of the challenges and hurdles that they face in order for these projects to be able to proceed and to proceed in a timely manner that then allows the government to achieve its own objectives under the NDCs. So in some way, you need to form a kind of like a secretariat a one-stop shop for each of the programs or the sectors where the private sector can go to, outline the challenges they are facing on their specific projects, and there's a government counterpart that will now hold their hands and help them to address the challenges they are facing so that these projects can get to the finish line expeditiously, so that government of Ghana, together with the private sector, have a high probability of achieving a lot of the programs that have been identified under the NDCs. Let me stop there. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Quite very fascinating comments and revelation for us as participants, and also as us as a country, for us to look at in order to be able to mobilize financing at scale for the implementation of Ghana climate agenda. And that's quite very clear from that point. I'll come back to some of the very important points that you have raised for response from our colleagues from the government. But I would like to hear from Daniel, particularly the kind of technologies that the government is looking at. I mean, I hear more solar, I hear more wind, I hear waste to energy. And I just want to know, what are the priority areas of government in terms of the kind of technologies that the private sector would be looking at? And probably also to give us a practical example of how you intend to operationalize the Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement with a view of having private sector deeply involved in it. So over to you, Daniel.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen and colleagues. So to answer your question regarding the priority technologies that are in the NDCs, already mentioned, it cut across a wide range of solutions, but I want to highlight a few. First one is the emerging interest in electric mobility as parts to become part and parcel of the urban mobility solution. That the Ministry of Transport and the Energy Commission is very much upbeat about that. Whilst they are focusing on creating the market standard and the policies, I'm aware that some private companies are already in the business of importing different forms of electric vehicles into the country. I'm aware of Hyundai already in having a prototype e-saloon vehicle in Ghana here, as I spent even last year. I'm also aware that ECG is partnering with a private company to establish charging stations for the e-vehicles. I'm aware that apart from the homes, there are plans to establish charging stations in key locations in Accra and the rest of the country. And I'm told that there is already one being planned at the shopping mall in the East Legon, the ANC mall. So already it appears that both the policy, the regulation, and the market and the interest of the private sector is already working hand in hand, as Richard indicated, to take advantage of this emerging market when it comes to electric mobility. That is one. Another example that is crucial to highlight is also the deployment of advanced solution for farming, digital farming. I mean, a private company called Isoko is deploying very basic, cost-effective, cheap digital solutions to connect smallholder farmers to markets. And already they are able to access their platform to get access to market prices of goods or produce quite regularly. Isoko is able to use their platform to help to disseminate weather information from GMET to the farmers. So the whole idea of connecting the smallholder farmers to the market is not only a way to increase or to help negotiate better their farm produce. It is also a way to diversify their incomes, right, and be able to build resilience to the impact of climate change. So that is the kind of collaboration or partnership that we are referring to. Partnership where private sector and is taking advantage of the opportunities that climate change presents, even as we tackle climate change. I want to end by talking about our effort to establish the regulation for to enable private sector to take advantage of the carbon market. So we hold the view that the advantages of that the carbon market presents go way beyond carbon, in a sense that not only is it a way to commoditize carbon and make revenues from it to augment your cash flow, it is also a way, as Richard said, a way to bring down here in this country technology and create jobs and make income, right, for the workers. So what we intend to do right now is to create the framework that will allow every private sector who's interested get access to a buyer of your carbon, to be able to make sure that the processes for developing your projects is that efficient in a way that it can reduce the cost of the upfront cost of developing your projects. The third one is also to have a consistent, clear, and coherent policy that drives the carbon market in Ghana. So whilst we are creating awareness and preaching about the opportunities that the market presents, we are at the same time putting in place the efficient system to allow private sector to get access to market actors. That we think is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's quite very clear to us. I will come back to Mr. Peter Derry on, the very important point that was made by Richard on if there's a need to have a very clear identification of projects that the private sector can participate, or areas that government themselves have made it very clear that these are the areas that we think we need more of the private sector support. I know you have both conditional and unconditional commitment at the Paris agreements, and each of them probably would give an opportunity for the private sector to be involved. But I'll go to Richard. We are quite aware. I know you have worked with the banks and you have the direct relationship with most of the financial institutions. I just want to hear from you again. What kind of financial instruments do you think that that the government can be promoting or can create the enabling framework to ensure that those financial instruments actually attract the needed financing from private sector to implement climate action in Ghana? Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. At the end of the day, most of the financing that the banks will be providing for many of these type of projects will have to be long-term debt financing. And when we talk about long-term, we are talking about financing over 10 years of tenure, okay? The reality is that, especially for the local banks, having deposits of that tenor that they can then use to lend to these kind of projects is quite limited. So you often find that the local banks will now be trying to keep the financing under 10 years, usually targeting a maximum of 7 to 8 years. So again, that is where government can work with the local banks to see how they can come with solutions that can then allow the banks to lend for the 10-year plus horizon. There are several solutions out there that have been trialed in many countries and work successfully, and those can also be deployed in the local environment. But again, it starts with a recognition that the banks, based on their deposits, can only lend this kind of tenor, but the projects need that additional tenor, and therefore, how does the government then come in to help them to stretch to achieve that? And then all also needs to be done with the Bank of Ghana, because Bank of Ghana needs to be able to look at these transactions when they do their audits and be comfortable that the banks have not extended themselves beyond what they should have done originally. So I think those solutions are there. And sometimes also it's a case of whether the banks are going to be lending in Ghanaian cedis or whether they are going to lend in foreign currency. And again, how do they access the foreign currency to be able to do that kind of tenor of financing? But again, we've seen various structures across the banking industry, and it's doable, but doable with the support of government, Bank of Ghana, and other government stakeholders.
Thank you very, very much. I would probably hand it over to Daniel to give us some kind of practical examples of the kind of instruments, or kind of examples that the government is intending to do or has done in the past in terms of getting the needed financing from the private sector in the implementation of climate action. So over to you, and you can combine that with your closing remarks on the various conversations that we've had over the last minutes. Thank you, Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think it's a good point that you made about the type of de-risking instruments that are available. Apart from the short tenure of credit, it's also this issue about the cost of the credit. It's quite expensive interest rate. So two things that have come to light quite recently is the possibility of piloting concessional arrangements with some key banks. I'm sure you've heard of this French-supported SANREF facility that is going to establish a blend of concessional and a guarantee mechanism to deal with the risk of having to deal with the short tenure of the credits of the facility that tend to shy away the beneficiaries. So that is one example. So it is looking at promoting energy efficiency, renewable energy, and efficient transportation solutions that would be such that the SANREF facility would deal with the effort of down the risk or that the bank intends will not bear. Then once you have that facility, it will help to reduce to that extent within the rate, the policy rate, how much you can cut down 1 or 2%, and also probably increase the tenure for the beneficiaries. That's the first one. Another example that is being piloted or that's being planned is this issue of performance-based schemes, which a good example is with the RED Plus and the World Bank, where, and even we are even about to pilot one for the food and beverage industry, where verified performance outcomes or indicators will be the basis to extend top-up payment to companies that are able to take climate action. Right. So that is what I want to say in terms of examples that are available to de-risk investment for private sector and also for the banks. My concluding remark is that over the years, the many actors, both the banks, the local commercial banks, the developers and the investors, the government, have their own respective challenges, right? Whilst we've talked about the issue about having coherent policy, having an attractive financing instrument, having to deal with issues about awareness and capacities, we hold the view that it is a time for us to come together, government, the local banks, and the developers, to work together to really take advantage of the opportunities that this regime presents. And the earlier we do this, the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for that. And like I indicated earlier, Mr. Peter Derry, I think a point was made by Richard that there's a need for government to be able to identify in the very clear terms or the kind of projects that they expect to partner with the private sector in implementing Ghana's climate agenda. I know we have the conditional and unconditional and there are discussions around creating a white list of projects that the private sector could pay, could partner with government in implementing our climate agenda. I don't know whether you have a comment to make on that, and probably also to provide us your concluding remark on the discussions we'll be having for the last minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yes, in terms of specific project, I think we've just discussed some of them. Daniel mentioned a number of them. I started by talking about the building of compost plants, which has been allocated to the private sector, and government has already even taken steps to begin to enter into specific PPP arrangement with some private companies to roll out this program. So that is very clear. The issue of the e-mobility has also been extensively dealt with by Daniel, which is also clear that it's coming from the private sector. He even talked about Hyundai that has already set a pace. In terms of mass transportation, it's purely a private sector-led program. And so we expect the private sector to come in there to provide these high capacity buses that will use efficient fuels to run and things like that. So those ones are clearly identified as private sector projects. And then we talked about that of the Swiss, even though government is facilitating the process, government is not going to be an implementer of this program. It's completely going to be led by the private sector in terms of implementation. So that has also been clearly identified. So there are a number of projects that have been clearly identified for the private sector. And like I said, in the current NDC document, we have an addendum to it that identifies specific projects. It's not just the report. We also have an annex that details out the specific projects and the ones that have to be allocated to the private sector. And these are the sectors. In fact, the private sector will be involved in renewable energy, no doubt, whether you're talking about solar or you're talking about wind. These are clear. And in terms of transparency for selection, we are going to use existing national legislations. So that's why the country has procurement laws. And we do this by involving the private sector at all the stages. For example, when we are carrying out the adverts, we make sure we bring in PEF or AGI. We have a discussion with them to be able to identify how the advert has to go out to be able to reach out to the targeted private sector players that we are looking up to. When it comes to evaluation, we get them involved in the evaluation of proposals and things like that. So we make sure that we carry the private sector along to ensure this idea or this issue of transparency in terms of selecting the projects. And the cooperation agreement that government has entered into with Switzerland shows a clear example of leadership, because he talked about providing leadership in terms of multilaterals and things like that. But this is a clear example of leadership. Government has entered into this agreement, providing a facilitative role, but not getting involved in implementation and saying that, look, private sector, we have provided the enabling space. Come, take it up and run with it. We are still even going ahead to provide the necessary infrastructure, like developing the registry and things like that, just to make sure that the private sector would have very good grounds to roll out Article 6 in this country. So that we are also doing. And then he talked about support in terms of the banks and things like that. Yes, and I think my colleague Daniel also dealt with it. The SunRef program that he talked about, these are programs that are geared towards looking at trying to subsidize credit for the private sector or provide some amount of guarantees. We all know that one of the biggest challenges in this country is the fact that interest rates are very high. And we also know that there are issues relating to repayment of loans. So the fact that government is putting in place some of these arrangements to provide subsidies or provide some amount of guarantees in order to allow private sector access finance from the banks is also a clear example of support that is coming from government to ensure that banks are able to provide the needed products to the private sector. So the government will continue to provide that leadership as we move into the implementation of the revised NDCs. And our focus is to ensure that the NDCs are implemented at scale. We will continue to involve the private sector. We see them as very crucial, and we would sit with them to discuss how we can support in de-risking private investments. We will continue to work with them to provide the needed incentives and making a business case for the NDCs, because we know that is very critical in order to be able to rake in foreign direct investments to support the private sector. We will also ensure that we work together to discard polluting technologies and move into clean technology for the private sector. And we know that it is the private sector that is actually using these technologies that we are talking about. So we need to work with them in order to be able to transition. The banks in Ghana are better governed and have shown interest in terms of responding to investments for the NDCs. And I'm sure that we can continue to work with them to provide the needed capital for the private sector and even beyond that. So these are the few concluding remarks that I will want to end with. And I believe that the private sector will continue to be a very important partner to government in this whole endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Derry. That's very clear and indeed demonstrates the level of commitment and leadership that the government is leading in terms of involving private sector in the whole discussion of climate change agenda in the country, and the various frameworks, policy frameworks, and kind of incentive schemes that have been put in place by governments to ensure the full participation of the private sector. And even the organizing this SDG fair is one of the commitments to demonstrate that government is ready to partner with the private sector in its development agenda in the country. I will now attempt to make a summary of the discussion that have taken place. I would probably want to hear from Richard your concluding remarks on the investment opportunity for private sector participation in Ghana's climate action. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I think to reiterate, I think the programs that have been outlined are achievable. There should be strong private sector interest for them, and there are definitely financing solutions to achieve these programs. It's about how we coordinate all this going forward and make sure that they are actually achieved. If you take, for example, the point that Daniel had mentioned about concessional financing. Concessional financing brought in under the private sector will really aim at achieving two things. One, if you are, for example, in the power sector, you want to make sure that your solar project or your wind project achieves a certain tariff that is affordable for the Ghanaian consumer. So that concessional financing comes in to buy down the tariff so that the cost of that project is something that is affordable for the Ghanaian consumer. Some of these funds, again, that Daniel mentioned, are really focused on helping the government to be able to work with the private sector such that these projects reach as many Ghanaians as possible. And that's what we call access, that as many Ghanaians have access to power, have access to waste management, have access to water supply, and a lot of these concessional funds come in to support the access agenda. So a lot of these solutions are out there, and it's about how we delve in project by project, crowding the private sector, crowding these financing solutions, and work with the government to unblock any hurdles that are needed to get these projects to the finish line and implemented.
Thank you very much, Richard, Peter, and Daniel. And on behalf of the Minister of Finance, Honorable Ken Foriata, we would like to thank you so much for availing yourself for this discussion. And I know there are quite a lot of comments that might probably come from our participants. And once those questions come up, we would expect that we provide the needed response. And I know also at the end of this fair, the Minister of Finance will compile a summary report of the discussions that have taken place, and then we can put it out in the public so that they can have access to the discussions and the various opportunities that exist. On behalf of the Minister of Finance, again, I thank you very much for this opportunity. I intentionally did not want to mention my name, but I think that it's important that I mention my name now. My name is Stephen Kansuk, and I work for the United Nations Development Program here in Ghana as a climate change technical specialist. And thank you and have a great day.